Cool. All right. Excellent. Okay, so welcome, folks. My name's Daniel Ploeg. I'm an accredited Kanban trainer and consultant through Kanban University. I've been doing Kanban stuff for a number of years now. I first came across it with probably about 10 or 12 years ago when Mary and Tom Poppendiek came to town and did a lean course, and I jumped on their course and they said, oh, hey, there's this great new, back then it was new, this great new blue book from David Anderson about Kanban. You should go check it out. And when Mary gives you some advice, you generally should follow it because it's usually bloody good. So I did and checked it out. And after that, I was hooked and sort of started to use it a little bit myself in the early years. In about 2015, got trained up by David Anderson himself and went and became, accredited consultant, and then went on to 2017, I think it was, I became an accredited trainer. And I've been doing training for a number of years since then. So, and obviously using training and using Kanban in my consulting work that I do over the years. But it's nice to come back to the roots here and just the basics and just help people get started with it. And I think this is the first time, obviously, I spoke to the Perth meetup. So I hope you all get a bit out of this. And, if you do want to ask a question, I'll take one or two questions as we go. But if it's too much, just chuck it in the chat. We'll have to keep moving because otherwise we'll run out of time, and we'll answer all the questions at the end. I'll hang around for a little bit if you guys want to get your questions answered. So this talk I've given a number of times in a number of companies or meetups and things like that, just to give people an idea about what Kanban's all about. There's a bit of stuff about me there. But Kanban is actually a management method. And we use it for directly improving our service delivery capability. Okay. We use it to catalyze improvements. It's we use it as a method of provocation to help people to move towards those improvements. And what's really behind it is evolving, your business to be fit for your customer's purpose. So it's not a one-size-fits-all type thing. You've actually got to think about your context, your customers, and what you're in business or what your organization is all about. Not just in commercial business, but you can apply this in obviously government context as well. And this is probably something that I think a lot of people miss. I think a lot of people go directly to, oh yeah, I've got a board, it's got to do in progress and done, so I'm doing Kanban. So I think, what I want to go over today is if that's your impression of Kanban, I hope to expose you to, how much more there actually is to Kanban. And there's probably a few people that might have that impression and they're not getting much value out of it because really there's not much that you're sort of putting in terms of that change. So hopefully through this and what we talk about tonight, you'll get an understanding of how you can actually get more out of Kanban. And some of this stuff is not terribly hard, and some of this stuff a lot of this stuff you don't necessarily need a lot of permission to go and do. You can probably try a lot of it at work tomorrow. Yeah, just start those conversations. So that's why we really like Kanban, and that's how that's how I run training and all of my consulting. I want to make sure it's practical and that you can actually start to use it. And actually, just going back to that management method part, I think this is also probably a missing link of Agile. In the early days, 20-odd years ago, it was much about, okay, we don't like these managers, they're giving us a hard time, but and so now we have Scrum Masters and other types of roles instead. But I think there's an important part about management that's actually missing in a lot of those Agile practices. And why this is actually quite useful as well is because you can actually use Kanban not just in technology areas. You can use these same practices in marketing teams, HR teams. I'm looking at the moment of how we apply it to legal practices. I know some people have done that, but we're looking to do some more specific stuff on how lawyers can actually use it in their context. But it's really the same basic principles that I'll take you through today. So what's really good about it is you can use these same basics across all aspects of your business. And as a bit of a cross promotion. I'm not sure if you guys are you guys familiar with the last conferences or the last talks? Because I'm doing a talk there, I think later this month or early next month, about how you can apply Kanban across your business. So there's a lot more to it than that.
Awesome. We'll have to share a link in our LinkedIn group, Dan.
Yeah, sure. I think they've just put up some advertising about it today. So I'll CC you in on that if you haven't already, and you can share it with the meetup group. All right, Kanban is all about evolutionary change. So it's not revolutionary. You're not supposed to go and install a massive new process day one. What we do with Kanban is start with what you do right now, okay? And we respect current roles and processes, at least initially. So this is quite different to other methods that you'll see. So the SAFe framework is quite different. There you have to train everyone, and then you have to reorganize people into release trains and then launch the release train. Yeah, big overhead. Scrum, for example, you need to set someone up as a Scrum Master, a product owner, you've got to set up your backlog and all that sort of stuff, and then get going. Yeah, that's quite disruptive because people actually need to learn new roles, and they're like, but I'm a project manager, I've been doing this for 10 or 20 years. But I'm a product manager. What's this product owner thing? And so there's a lot of confusion, and that creates resistance to the change right off the bat. Now, the good thing about Kanban with the start with what you do now is actually you can avoid a lot of that resistance by showing one of the key values of Kanban of respect. Yeah, for what people are doing. Now, I kind of also like this as well. This is probably one of my favorite parts of Kanban is you start with what you do now, because generally a lot of businesses got where they are because they had some form of success. Saying, sometimes like with SAFe and that, I feel like the consultants come in and say, you're doing it all wrong, you've got to do it like this. But, give people credit, that they actually have been in business for a little while. Otherwise, they wouldn't need your help. Just at least respect them and give them some help where it's useful. Now, the next step is we gain agreement to pursue improvement through evolutionary change. Okay, so we're going to make lots of little improvements as we go, and that whole piece earlier about catalyzing improvements, that's all part of it. So when I talk about the feedback loops later, you'll see that their key points where we can create these spaces for the improvement to happen. Okay. And then, of course, the last one is encouraging acts of leadership at all levels. Yeah, you don't necessarily need senior management permission to go off and do this stuff. Yeah, you can just go talk to the team and start it tomorrow. What's important is that acts of leadership at all levels. So it can come from your team members, individual contributors, through middle management, through to executives. There are different points where you need leadership through all of that, and generally, when we think about acts of leadership, it's about having a little bit of courage to challenge the status quo and maybe make that improvement. Okay. So we generally encourage people to be fairly, to have a bit of courage and follow their instincts and the data as well, to try out new changes. Okay, so that's the evolutionary change piece. The other piece people probably aren't very aware of is the service delivery principles. So Kanban's all about improving service delivery. So the first principle there is actually understand your customers' needs and their expectations. I see a lot of people, when I start, some training or consulting, my question is repeatedly, who is your customer and what do they ask you for? Who is your, we've got this project manager now. Who is your customer and what do they ask you for? So actually looking at what is the need there. And the customer in this context might not necessarily always be the person that's buying your product or service outside your company. It might be someone else. Like a lot of companies that I work with are in regulated areas. So they actually have to deal with requests coming through the government, through regulators. So banking, energy, those sorts of areas, this is very prevalent. So there are needs from those groups, and to stay in business, you actually need to address those needs. So we treat them, you know, like any other customer request. The second part is manage the work and let the workers self-organize around it. It's not saying that people could go off and entirely, you know, self-organize and do everything. There is a responsibility there to help manage the work. And by that, I mean the system of work. We actually have to create and improve the overall system or systems of work. That's the key there with Kanban. We're trying to create robust and resilient systems of work that are fit for purpose. And the last part there is regularly review the network and its policies to improve the outcomes. So one part about this, I guess a bit of a preface to this point, is that your organization actually is a network of interdependent services that come together to fulfill customer needs. And this is why I talked about applying Kanban to marketing or sales, HR, legal, technology, product management. All of these groups are services that come in to help provide a product or end service to your customers. So there is a network of those things. I was talking about about this in one of my training courses today, and one of the things that we were talking about was that the fallacy that I think a lot of Agile shops talk about high-performing teams. I think sometimes creating a high-performing team is actually a sub-optimization, because if you've got work that travels through multiple teams and you're optimizing for this one team, you're probably sub-optimizing across the whole for the customer. Yeah. So what we really probably don't want high-performing teams. We want a high-performing Agile organization. Okay. So is the organization itself Agile? You know, not just this one or two key teams. Yeah. And that's why we look at the whole network and its policies, and I'll talk a bit more about policies in a moment, and improve those outcomes. So the system is made up of or described by its policies, and I'll go through that in a little while, and that's why we improve those. All right. So did we have any questions we wanted to go through so far, Will, or should I just keep going on?
I'd just say keep rolling. I can't see anyone pop up just yet, but lots of agreement and some good notes. Yeah. Cool.
Okay. Here we go. We've got half a dozen Kanban practices. These are really key. It's not just a board with to do, doing and done. I quite often have people that come up to me and says, yeah, we selected Kanban on Jira, so we're doing Kanban. It's like, okay, all right, stand back a bit. You know, there's a little bit more to it than that. And so I'm going to take you through some of these core practices so that you can get more out of your Kanban implementation. Okay, so Visualise is there. It's one of them. But there are a whole bunch of other things. You know, probably the key things really are the explicit policies and or the feedback loops. And indeed, the case study that was in the original book that we talk about at XIT at Microsoft, there was no visualization, okay? So that they actually relied on all of these other things, particularly limit WIP and managing the flow, to really make some improvements. All right, so let's look at the first one. So Visualise. You'll see there's actually a number of things going on this visual board. So let's have a look at this. We've got an overall workflow I've used the term backlog to done. I probably shouldn't have used the word backlog. It's a bit of an old deck, I guess. Should have touched that up. I usually use the term options here, and I'll go into that at another time. But suffice it to say, things move from the left to the right. Okay. Things tend to not go backwards. Usually if something goes backwards, it's a sign that maybe something went wrong in the process. Maybe we need to look at these policies again. Yeah. I mean, you can go backwards, but it's going to mess with I'll talk about data in a little while. It'll mess with your data and it'll mess with your WIP limits. So just be careful. These numbers up here, 2, 3, 2 and 1, they're the WIP limits. So this means no more than 2 items in the to-do column, no more than 3 items in development, that includes ongoing and done, no more than 2 in testing, and you can see it's at its WIP limit there. Deployments 1, done is, there's nothing in done, okay, in terms of a WIP limit. We see these little tokens or avatars to show us who's working on what. They're pretty standard. There's also, you can see here, there's a different colored item there. So that might actually be a different work item type. And we see a little marker up here, which says P1. That might be a different class of service. So, whoops. So there's lots of things actually going on this board. Oh, and there's, I'm not sure if I mentioned, but these things are the policies here. And they describe, you know, what needs to be done as part of that process. So compared to a regular board that's just got to do, doing and done, this is a lot richer. And this is only a very basic version of a Kanban board as well. So you can see that the visualization can be quite rich and you can get a lot out of it. It's really, there's so much more that you can do. Now, you may be constrained by the electronic tools. We're experiencing this a lot since COVID started. People aren't using physical boards anymore because they're just not co-located. So you're constrained by your tooling. And if I had to guess, I'm probably guessing most of you are on a tool that starts with the letter J. Yeah, okay. And little thing like Jira as a Kanban tool is less mature, so it won't let you put a WIP limit like number 3 above these, you know, ongoing and done. So I've got there's a blog post on my blog, so we'll point to that at the end, that talks about some hacks and stuff that you can do on Jira to actually start to do things like these visualizations a bit better. But there's a lot of things it can't do, like it doesn't put the policies on the board and things like that as well. So for those of you on Jira, I'm sorry. You can't do all the cool stuff that a lot of other great Kanban tools can do. All right, so there's no standard board design, okay? If someone tells you, you've got to use the standard board design, everyone in the company is doing this. And I've wrestled with this a lot. And, you know, a lot of people say, you know, you've got to use the standard design. I say, no, that's ridiculous, because the people in the data team are doing something completely different to the people in the software team, which is completely different to the people in the marketing team. Why on earth should they be the same? Their process isn't the same, it's different. This is knowledge work. Yeah, Azure DevOps, yep, okay. Azure DevOps is kind of okay, but it suffers a lot of similar problems to Jira as well. Yeah, so modify the boards and the cards to suit the needs of your context, okay? So don't follow the standard thing. Some people say, oh, we need to capture all of the data, so everything needs to be in the right place. And that's actually rubbish. You're probably, you know, capturing the wrong data points. I tell people, and I'll talk about it in a moment, just capture lead time and let people do whatever it is that they need to for their process underneath it. Put the data up near the boards. The data and the boards are key feedback mechanisms. Yeah, you know, you see what's going on. You can actually see problems right away, and that's a really good reflection and feedback mechanism. Just looking at the board. Yeah. And putting the data up with it. Sometimes with the data and the board together, you can actually get a lot more out of it. And obviously, boards are physical, electronic. Now, limiting WIP, there are a number of ways to limit WIP. The key point, the key reason why we limit WIP is because we actually have a fixed capacity. A lot of folks don't like to admit it in knowledge work, but there is a capacity. It's like if I took this glass of water and I took a big jug and I started pouring more and more water into it, at some point it's going to overflow. There is actually a capacity limit on this glass. It might be a bit hard to see the lip of the glass, but it's there. Knowledge work is the same. Sometimes it's a bit hard to see what the limit is, but it's going to be there, because if you don't adhere to the limit, what you're going to do is, one, you're going to burn people out. Two, you're going to slow down things for your customers anyway. And then you're going to create other things like quality and other issues. So, you know, if you don't have your WIP limits, you're going to get the wrong outcomes for your people and your customers. Okay, you're kidding yourself, because that capacity is there. It's a limit, it's a constraint. So there are a number of ways you can do that. A very basic, simple way just to get started is just on the avatars or tokens. So just say, okay, a maximum of 2 tokens per person. So you can't work on more than 2 things at once, you know, because otherwise you get all this context switching overhead and you never get anything done. That's one way to do it. Here is another way to do it, is swim lanes, like saying, okay, 1 ticket per swim lane or something along those lines, or, you know, those are sort of, that's one way of doing it. Some people use tape on boards for this, which is okay because it actually shows you physically there are slots. What a lot of people don't realize is the Kanban isn't the board, it's the slot described by the WIP limits that shows your capacity to pull in new work. The Kanban is the slot. Okay. But it's a real pain, because if you need to change your WIP limits, then you've got to rip off all this tape and do all sorts of other things. So it's much easier just to use this virtual Kanban where you just put a number on the top. In the days pre-COVID where it was a physical board, I just used to have a post-it note with a number scribbled on it, and if we needed to renegotiate that number, I'd scrunch it up, throw it away, put another one up. It takes all of about 3 seconds. So when you're designing your Kanban boards and using things like WIP limits, make sure that it's flexible and allows improvement. Okay, now this column here, we can't, even though C is done, we're not going to pull that into testing until we move B into deployment, because we're at our WIP limit. And that's where WIP limits above both of these ongoing and done things are actually quite useful, because we can see that this thing's done and it's ready to pull to deployment, but these, you know, for whatever reason, that's not ready yet to move out. And we shouldn't pull this in until something else moves out. What ends up happening is if this fills up, eventually this is going to fill up and that's going to fill up and the whole system stalls. What does that mean? We need to actually go downstream and fix the problem down here and then get stuff flowing again. Yeah. All right. So that's limiting WIP. All right, managing flow. So flow is all about, there's a customer with a request at one end. At some point, we want to fulfill that customer's request, and there's some kind of workflow in between, a very high level. Okay, so in that workflow, what you can see is a bottleneck. Yeah, you can see bottlenecks start to form. The way you see bottlenecks is usually, particularly if you've got a board like this, whoops, what'll happen is eventually things are going to pile up in this development done. And so if things pile up ahead of something, then that something is the bottleneck, usually. If you don't have WIP limits, when you see a whole heap of stuff in that area, then that's where the bottleneck actually is. What we're trying to do is we're trying to balance our input and output. Okay, if we can only finish 3 items a week, why on earth are we pulling in 5 items a week to start with? We should balance our input and output. Yeah, okay. Are we balancing our risk correctly? So this is a big thing, you know, do we have a good spread of the right work item types? Do we have a good spread of the right classes of service? Are we, are we doing the right things at the right time? You know, those are things that that we consider business risks. Okay, around different work item types and different classes of service. What is lead time? So there's 2 forms of lead time here. So there are 2. The first form is sometimes let's say you're in a team and maybe some other team is looking after deployment. So, you know, on your board, you can go all the way to deployment, but that stuff's managed somewhere else. You know, there's an infinite WIP limit there because we don't know what on earth that is. There's maybe nothing there. So the system lead time is to the first unbound queue. Ideally, it's the done queue and it's in the customer's hands, but sometimes your process doesn't work like that. So to start with, we measure the system lead time from the commit point. Yeah, not when it hits the backlog. when we actually commit and we say we're going to deliver this thing, yeah, which is maybe when we pull it into this to-do column to the point of the first unbound queue. Now, the reason why we measure it to the point of an unbound queue is unbound queues are unpredictable. There could be one thing in there, there could be 1,000 things in there. They're inherently unpredictable. If there's something with a WIP limit, it's constrained. There's a predictability to it. So if you want a predictable system of work, you actually need to use WIP limits and constrain that to the capacity. If you've got unlimited queues or unlimited work areas where there's no WIP limits, you've not got a predictable system. It's a trap for a lot of young players, that one, is that they want a predictable system, but they don't put the measures in place to be able to do that. WIP limits are key to creating a predictable system. So that's system lead time. The customer lead time is when they actually get it in their hands. So we talk about customer lead time as well. So when we commit to delivering it to when they actually get it. And that even if it does include this infinite thing as well. And ideally, if you can get the system lead time to the same thing as the customer lead time and you're just measuring one thing, that's the ideal. But if you're just starting off, maybe you need to measure those things differently because your sphere of influence and control is different. Okay, so lead time is not a single number. How long is something going to take to get done? If someone says it's 30 days, then they're giving you the wrong data. Now, lead time isn't a single number. You can see here, here's an actual lead time of some work that I did over the course of the year. And you can see there's not a single, one lead time. So the lead time over here is over there on the y-axis, and the dates when they got done are on this x-axis. And you can see some of them really blew out. Okay, so your lead time is actually a distribution. It'd be better to say, the average item gets done within about 12 days, but at, the 80, what's this? I think this is the 90th percentile is at 55 days. Yeah. So now we're giving a range, and it's likely to fall somewhere within that range. One of the traps a lot of Agile teams do, and I've seen this with a lot of Scrum teams, they say, yeah, our average velocity is blah, 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 blah. And that's where they shoot themselves in the foot. A couple of reasons. One, because velocity is based upon an estimate of how long we think it might take. Lead time is actuals based on our observed capability. Okay. The second reason is that it's an average. So if Bill Gates walked onto this Zoom call, the average net wealth of each person on the Zoom call would be measured in the billions of dollars. Now, I'm pretty sure that's not my net wealth, and it's probably not your net wealth. So just be very careful of averages, because, when you get into that, what they call extremistan positions, you can really shoot yourself in the foot. Okay. And you don't want to make commitments like that, because the thing is, the other thing about averages is you're wrong half the time or thereabouts. And do you really want to be making commitments where you're wrong half the time? Okay, here's something we use quite commonly in Kanban. This I took off. Has anyone played the Get Kanban game? Because there's a new virtual version coming out, and this image actually came off one of the betas of that. I was playing that with a guy that created it, and this is the CFD that come out of it. And you can see here a couple of things. So a cumulative flow diagram has counts of the items that move through the process. So I think this is back or sort of selected or next, analysis, development, testing, and done. I think that's what it is from memory. And you can see things moving through the process. So there's a couple of things you can see. You can see this sort of choppy flow where things are coming in these sort of different points. Whereas later on, you can see that's actually smoothed out. Yeah. So this usually means that you have a replenishment at a regular cadence, like weekly, fortnightly, or monthly. You'll see this where you pull new tickets in, and it takes a little while to wear that buffer down. The other thing is around this end where, here is deployment that is done on a sort of cadence, if you like. At this point, it smooths out because they do deployment on demand. So there are ways you can smooth flow. When you see the height of the chart go up, that means you're getting more and more whip into the system or that particular area. So this is actually, with the more whip coming through there, it's actually a potential bottleneck that you've got. So you can see that in the height. And whoops. The other thing you can see is the delivery rate. So from here to here, you see the angle's fairly shallow. You see past there, the angle actually goes up. So the delivery rate or throughput goes up. We're delivering more stuff over a period of time. Okay. The other thing you can see on these charts is the lead time. So here on day, it was about day 2 or 3, stuff came in and it went out on about day 9. So we've got about a 6-day lead time. Whereas here, things went in on about day 15 and they went out on about day 18. So it's a 2-day lead time. So we've gone from 6 days down to about 2 days. Yeah, so you can see the improvement for the customer there. So the cumulative flow diagram can actually tell you a lot about the health of the flow in your system. It's the one chart in Jira that's actually kind of useful. The rest of the reports in there are pretty much garbage. All right, the other thing around managing flow is around risk. So we use classes of service, so we're balancing competing risks. So is there another slide on this? No. Okay, so, whoops, gone too far. What are classes of service? So classes of service are things like, they represent different policies in the system for different, I don't like to use the term priorities because they're not a priority. They're really based upon something like cost of delay or impact, those kinds of things. So most of your items are probably going to be a standard class of service. Occasionally you might have something with a fixed date class of service, and there's also an expedite. So, okay, Amazon just went down, all hands on deck, fix the thing because we're losing millions every day. That kind of thing. Most of your items will be standard. The other archetype for a class of service is intangible, where the cost of delay, intangible is cost of delay is going to hit you at some point in the future. At this point, the cost of delay is not that great, but it'll start to increase over time. A fixed date is something along the lines of, nothing's going to hit you until a certain point of time. Then if you don't have it, then you're going to have a certain hit. The classic examples of that is if you don't get a regulatory thing done in time and you get a fine or some sort of reprimand from the government. The other thing that's a good example there is if you're prepping stuff for like a trade show and the trade show is on that date, and if you don't hit that date, then there's no value from that item and you can't get money back from it. If there's anyone in the gambling industry, I know that folks in the gambling industry, the big one is Melbourne Cup Day. If you don't have stuff ready for Melbourne Cup Day, forget about it. It's going to be another year before you can realise that, if it's even useful. So they might be fixed date items. And how you handle those things once it's in the flow is based upon the policies. I'll talk now a little bit about explicit policies. So what do I mean about explicit policies? They're visible to all. They're always followed, for each item. And they're not big pre-flight checklists that are as long as your arm. They're usually, 4, maybe 5 or 6 items, just a little checklist. And they don't have to be, in a major amount of detail. Because what you want to do is when you move the card from here to here, you want to just do a little head check. Have I got this? Yes, yes. Oh, no, I've missed that. I'll just finish that off before I move it across. Yeah. So those are policies that relate to, particular stages on the board. You might have a lot of Agilists use definitions of done or definitions of ready. Those kinds of things are fairly common. But you can do that at each step of the way. The other thing is, so for example, if we have a process here, the testers might dictate some of the terms for what development done means. I need a binary deployed into the test environment or be ready to deploy in the test environment. So, those kinds of things might be part of the policies. Now, policies can also relate to how things come onto the board. So, you know, the classes of service, for example, if I get an expedite, the policy might be drop whatever you're doing, grab whatever team members you need to get this thing done as a matter of, you know, urgency. Okay. So the policy, you know, that policy sort of explains how the team is supposed to behave, how we manage the work, you know, so that manage the work, let the workers self-organize around it. A lot of that is defined by the policies in the system. They describe how the system of work works. Okay. Yeah, so very important, the policies. And they're not static. They should be reviewed and improved and changed and modified as the team learns more about how their process works and how to optimize it. If I see the same policies on a team 6 or 12 months down the track as to what it was, you know, a while back, then there's something wrong. It should never be fully set in stone. They should always be improving. If a team does have something set in stone like that, it means there's a problem. They're not improving. They've plateaued. Okay, feedback loops. There's a couple of key feedback loops. So for each service, there's usually these key ones. We have replenishment. That's where you move stuff from your options or backlog into, yes, we're going to commit to delivering these things. Okay, so you move those items over the commit point, and usually there's a conversation. In the more mature systems, there's a conversation with the customer as to which of the items we're going to commit to. Okay, so we've got 10 options, we've got 3 slots. Out of those 10 items, which 3 do we want next? The Kanban meeting. So you're all probably pretty familiar with stand-up meetings, yeah? So it's kind of that, but in Kanban terms. Now, Scrum, the typical Scrum things, I think they might have removed it from the Scrum guide, but years ago it was, what did you do yesterday? What are you going to do today? What are your impediments? Now, we don't talk about that in Kanban because, you know, we've got this, we've got the board here that tells us all of that. We can see who's working on what, we can see what's moved to done. And quite often we have blocker stickies on cards. So if something's blocked, we can see it straight off. So we don't need to ask those questions. We walk the board from right to left. Yeah. Focus on finishing first, stop starting, start finishing. And that's why we walk the board from right to left. And we look at, okay, so who needs help, who's free for new work? And we might focus in on a few of those items that have the blocker sticky on them, or that might be aging WIP. It's getting old, it's been sitting there a little while. You might focus in on those things, okay? But we don't do the, you know, zombie Scrum thing of what you did yesterday, what are you going to do today? We walk the board. All right, delivery planning, you don't always need to do that, but suffice it to say, in those systems that aren't deploy on demand kind of things, sometimes you need to coordinate the deployments, or, you know, you might have less frequent deployments, like maybe once a month or even once a quarter. I know, like, for example, in the big banks, the retail, or in, I know Australia Post did this, that you can't deploy something to your production environment every day, or even mobile phones. Imagine how pissed off you get if you had to update an app twice a day. You know, that's just annoying. So, you can't necessarily always deploy every day. So there might be a bit of planning around how you do that delivery and making sure the right items are in that next release package, whatever that is. There's a service delivery review. In lower maturity versions, it's also known as the flow review. So that's when you look at the data, lead time, fit for purpose metrics, those kind of things. Review that with the customer. Is the service matching your expectations? What do we need to do to change it so that it actually is more fit for purpose? Do we have to look at lead times? Do we have to look at quality? Do we have to look at, I don't know, wait times or response times, classes of service, work item types, those kinds of things. Okay, so risk review, you can either do that on one system or across multiple systems. That's where we're looking at the tail of the lead time and trying to figure out what are the business risks that we're impacting and how do we deal with that. The ops review is a system of systems review. So you've got multiple of these different service sets, and how do they interact? So that what we were talking about improving the network. So that's when that is really about improving the network. So how do these services across the organization interact, and how do we deal with dependencies, blockers, all of those sorts of things. And strategy reviews, obviously, you know, sort of an organizational strategy. What are we targeting next, and those kinds of things. And, you know, information flows in between these different feedback loops. All right. So these actually, just before I move on, the feedback loops are actually a key reflection point. So we create some stress on the system. We reflect, and we through the feedback loops, and we expect some acts of leadership to come out. So let's go do something about it. Okay, you see this problem. I mentioned that courage earlier. Let's go do something about it. That's the real key thing. Active management, not laissez-faire, not passive. You've got to be in there doing your job. All right, improve and evolve. So there's different aspects to improvement. So there's Kaizen, little things that can be done at the team level, you know, continuously going. Occasionally, managers need to step in and actually create some of that improvement, negotiate that, because that's not something the team can do on their own. So we call them sort of kaikaku level events, you know, so that they're the sort of manager-led improvements. And as I mentioned, those improvements occur through the feedback loops. And we want to use the data that we talked about earlier. So, you know, we'll have a hypothesis, or we'll have an observation, develop a hypothesis, you know, and then we'll say, okay, we think if we change this, it's going to actually trim the tail of our lead time. So we run an experiment to see what it actually does. Did it trim the tail? Or it trimmed some of it, but maybe we've got to do something else to get these other things out. Okay, so we run an experiment and then watch what happens as a result of it, and then decide, do we roll forward? Do we roll back? Do we sort of double down on that improvement, or change something else? So, you know, we use data and a bit of scientific method there when we do those improvements in Kanban. Oh, that's it. I think I've come to the end of it. So today we've talked about the different, you know, Kanban's a management method. We've got the service delivery principles. We've got the change management principles. So something I don't think I've seen change management in any of the other agile methods. Yeah, so it's very distinctive in Kanban. And we've got the 6 key practices that we've talked through today. Now, if you start to use these, you know, it's like some of these, like visualizing, chucking stuff on the board, you know, doing the right things, maybe changing up your Kanban meeting, defining your commitment point and done points, getting some replenishment actually going. These things you don't necessarily need a whole lot of permission for. You can actually go and try tomorrow. So do go ahead and try that tomorrow. If you want to learn more, there's a couple of good books. Like this is a freebie one. This not the physical copy, but you can get this Essential Kanban Condensed. You can get a free PDF version through that link that's on there. The Personal Kanban from Tony Ann and Jim, it's been around for ages, but it's still pretty neat. The blue book that I showed you. And there's also a new Kanban guide released. So you can check that out as well through that link. Yeah. The other thing I've got is on my website, I've got bucket loads of blogs. I've got videos and those sorts of things as well that'll be interesting to you. So do check out my page, because there's a lot of free content as well. If you're really interested and you want to learn more, you can get more formal training that I offer on this. So do check that out as well on the website. Probably a good place to start, I think, is this Kanban system design if you've not done anything before.